Good evening, everybody. Good to see a big crowd again. I think I know most of you, but if you don't know me, I'm Simon Birch. I'm chair of the Civic Society. Welcome to this evening's entertainment, which is from Alfred Hall, Monaghan Morris, who many of you will know, or if you don't know them, you'll know of their buildings in Bristol and elsewhere. They're going to talk about a decade in Bristol, and I'm not quite sure who we've got because one of our speakers is actually the planning committee, I think, at the moment. But we're going to start off with Steve Taylor, who will introduce himself and the company. So over to you, Steve.
Fantastic. Thanks, Simon. And I'm going to attempt to share screen. So hopefully you give me a thumbs up, Simon, once that's arrived. Fantastic. So hopefully there's not too much of a delay in the technology this evening. But thanks, Simon, for the introduction. And thanks, everyone, for turning up. It's wonderful to see so many faces and names on Zoom, a sort of platform we've all become remarkably familiar with over the last 12 months. And it does feel like we're coming towards the end of it. But lots of lessons and skills learned along the way as we emerge out of the pandemic and hopefully back to some new kind of normal. So, as the title here suggests, it's a decade in Bristol for us, but we sort of rounded it sort of down a bit, really. We first arrived in Bristol in 2007. We took up space below George Ferguson, actually, at the tobacco factory. Shortly after that, recession hit. We sort of then subsequently rattled around tobacco factory for a while, making lots of cups of tea and trying to look busy. And then our numbers have kind of steadily grown from then. We're now a sort of practice in Bristol of just over 60 members of staff. So a lot bigger than we originally had thought. But we never entered Bristol as a kind of regional enterprise for the business. It was very much as a kind of satellite resource to our sort of mothership, as we often refer to it, which is based in London. And it was an attitude towards architecture that we shared across the offices that kind of meant that we really tackled any project that came across the desks or the drawing boards. And if we had the time and resource available in our Bristol office, we would pick that project up. So whilst we've been in Bristol a little over a decade, actually, it's really only been the last short number of years, most recent years, that we've started building buildings in the city. It's a city we obviously love and want to be able to contribute to its architectural legacy. So it's great for us to be able to have this opportunity to present some of our work tonight. So whilst we've been in Bristol a little over 10 years, a lot of the work you're seeing tonight will be fairly recent. So really we're going to look at about 6 projects. But before we do, I'll give you a bit of background for those who aren't familiar with us as a practice. So on the left-hand side of this slide, either sort of Reservoir Dogs moody image or a kind of 80s boy band, I'll leave you to decide. But the 4 partners, Alfred Hall, Monaghan Morris, originally met at university at the Bartlett, studying for their diploma. And they discovered a shared interest in architecture and a complementary set of skills and attitudes towards it, which remain the same today, actually. So the slide on the right-hand side here, the image on the right, is a more recent image of the 4 gentlemen standing outside an award ceremony where we had recently won the Sterling Prize for our Burntwood Academy secondary school in London. It was actually our kind of 3rd time lucky at the Sterling Awards. But for those of you who might be unfamiliar with that, they're the sort of Oscars for architects, or certainly we like to think of them as being that in the UK. So a real seminal moment for us as a practice in 2015. Shortly after that, 2018, we actually moved from being a partnership with the 4 founding partners to an employee ownership trust. So very much like the Co-op or John Lewis, we all have a share in the business. It is a kind of cooperative of architects and, of course, all the support staff that help us do and produce and enjoy architecture. So we're a firm of around 550 people, around 490 of those, the kind of closest count, are architects. And then we've got a sort of team of about 60 in lots of different research projects, support functions. We've got a very functional, very successful model shop that helps us study architecture in 3 dimensions at all stages, large and small, detailed and strategic. So really important sort of resource for the office. So we're all part of that co-op, and what the partners put together was a founder's statement, which was really our attitude towards architecture around 3 principles, one of architecture, one of alliance, and one of ambition. And it's about those kind of guiding principles that help us as a practice sort of continue and approach all of our work. And it's about an idea of those guiding principles, and really a notion that the partners developed, the 4 founding partners developed whilst working together at university. And firstly, it was for them about how the field of everyday building, rather than public buildings, that modern architecture has failed the city. So it's very much about the ordinary and the extraordinary, those kind of ordinary buildings ultimately becoming extraordinary. And it's secondly about the functional program alone is not sufficient to generate an architecture. So form follows function, function follows form. It's about constructing the idea. It's about understanding all the influence that affects architecture and its place from a strategic sort of citywide scale right down to the places where we live, work, get educated, get cared for. And it's about those sort of very average everyday buildings and making them extraordinary. So the idea about constructing the idea is important for us. It's also a kind of theory of obliquity. It's about not really coming to at a solution too early. It's about finding that solution through the process and approach, which we enjoy. Very much like this image is, some of you might recognise it, it's Buckminster Fuller. It's this idea of, ultimately he went on to develop geodesic domes. This was an idea actually around how the tragic loss of his daughter at a very young age, due to what he contributed to poor living conditions in a city, how actually that could be a drive for change, a force for change. And the idea about how you might enclose a city and improve that environment in order to improve the quality of how people live and work in those cities. So coming at a solution from a slightly different angle. So it's about the extraordinary. It's about turning the ordinary into extraordinary and identifying that buildings are there with some legacy, and that legacy and use can change over time. This is one of the last remaining cast iron buildings in New York on Spring Street. It's a former warehouse, now a museum, previously a home, and an art gallery for Donald Judd, the American sculptor. So how buildings can change over their lifespan, again, and becoming extraordinary as a legacy, really important. It's also for us about aiming to miss. It's about that sort of indirect route to the solution and not coming to a kind of an answer too quickly, but clearly as architects and designers, problem solving's what really drives us in our design. So this slide is there to represent an idea first posed by Cedric Price, the architect teacher, who sort of said it's not necessarily about designing a bridge, it's about how best to get to the other side. So for us, it's about understanding that brief, developing the brief and finding the solution through that process. So part of that sort of attitude has taken us through lots of projects over the last 30 years or more, working in lots of different sectors. And I'm going to start tonight talking about one project which isn't in Bristol, it's in London, but it's a seminal project for me and others in the Bristol studio because it was one designed and delivered from Bristol, albeit in London. And it's a seminal project for our practice and also particularly for us in Bristol. And it was a project which in itself was born out of a number of projects, working with a client called Derwent London, who are a real estate investment trust. So they keep hold of their buildings, they invest, they build, they learn, and they improve from building to building. And that's their business has followed a path, a sort of progression very similar to ours, in the fact that every building that we produce is a kind of precursor to the next. You know, there's a story that runs through a lot of our architecture. Rather than individual moments, it's about challenging ourselves again and again, making the sort of best approach again and again. So this was an idea, or the journey of an idea, looking at a number of buildings, which the ones on the slides here are all found buildings, existing buildings, most of which never designed for their use as repurposed in the 21st century. They're all office buildings or mix of uses, but invariably designed and built originally for very different uses. And it was a question posed to us by this developer saying, what is it about those old buildings? Buildings 150 years old, what attracts us to those buildings to want to buy them and then spend investment to develop them into something which is very usable in the 21st century? They were never designed for that for that use, and yet they fit that use perfectly well. So why is it? What's the quality and characteristics of those projects and those buildings? And the bigger question is, why does modern architecture not provide that same characteristic? So what that question posed for us was, or set us along the line of looking at research and then developing a concept which we termed the white collar factory concept. And it was about those buildings having a characteristic about generosity of height, tall ceilings, about very passive and basic servicing or smart servicing, about sort of robustness of structure, coolness that can come from heavyweight structure that keeps the sun out but lets daylight in where you need it. So structure working alongside facade and being very passive in its attitude towards the environment. It's about very efficient and regular deep floor plans that allow flexibility in use and a change of use over time. So these buildings have a robustness in their structure, but also a robustness to change that gives them a legacy that gives us the ability as designers to reinvent those buildings over time. And I think that's really pertinent to today, and certainly coming out of the pandemic, there seems to be this acute now sort of reset even attitude towards the environment and the carbon story. The carbon that we capture in our structures, and 40% of the world's carbon is from buildings, the creation, making, and operating of buildings. So if we can affect that, we're on a good thing. So the idea of retaining carbon and structure in projects and reinventing them for the future is a kind of smart approach to the environment. So that concept developed into a suite of principles, and it developed ultimately then into a prototype. So we set those that sort of research to concept to principles to prototype. So we built a small building that tested these principles, and it was about office environments that was where you could open a window for fresh air, where the space was cooled by running cold water through the concrete slabs, not with air conditioning. It's a very passive approach, a very sort of human scale approach, and something that the occupants could then engage with and control. And we built that prototype in a car park near our office in London on stilts, where it could afford to breathe a bit, but also be exposed to the elements and the sort of solar orientation. So facades that then changed to suit those solar orientations as well. So we built the project, we operated it for 12 months, we gathered the data to prove that the concept worked, and then we took it on to site. So this was the site at the corner of Old Street Roundabout, for those of you who might recognise it in London, kind of east of the city. And we built a project there which was in part retaining some old buildings and then replacing the other unusable parts of the site with new. So it was a project of 6 buildings, a courtyard to the back here, hopefully you can see my cursor, and then a 16-storey building to the front. And it was a project which was really, for us, about this idea of a city sandwich, so a mix of use. So it was commercial-led, but it was very important for us to create this character space with a mix of uses. So it's the idea that there's a club at the roof, a sort of private space for the building occupants to enjoy at rooftop and enjoy those views. It's about this idea of this running track around the top of this building. The tops of tall buildings tend to be set away from its sort of primary facade to allow for cleaning apparatus to sort of trundle around a track around the perimeter of the rooftop in order to hang very brave individuals in carriages to then clean and maintain facades. So this sort of perimeter track, we felt, well, actually, when it's not being used for cleaning the building, it could be used for something else as this extra amenity for the building occupants. It was then about 15 floors of flexible workspace for lots of different occupiers, a multi-use, multi-let building. We had a public coffee shop in the reception. So rather than a very stale corporate environment, this was very much an open, almost kind of bookstore environment where one could come in and sort of converse and meet people from the building in the reception and enjoy a coffee or a lunch. It was the introduction of a public courtyard and garden at the heart of this project. So very, very urban, quite a sort of a sort of edgy environment, if you like, So the idea of providing this enclave, this sort of courtyard where people can enter buildings from, so all the addresses are within this sort of courtyard, fully public accessible 24/7. It's a nice idea. Cyclists being a really big part of our cities and how we move about them, so providing facilities for those. And then the idea of smaller buildings, so not just large floor plates for large corporate occupiers, but the idea of smaller floor plates for incubators and startups. So people who are starting out their businesses can rent space here, develop with this client, and ultimately take other space in the building or elsewhere in their portfolio. So as a developer, very very keen on sort of nurturing talent and nurturing businesses. And then there's also an element of housing, as I say, as a kind of mixed-use scheme in a city, with some food and beverage at street level. And then ultimately, I'll come back to this room because it's really important to us now as AHMM, a room beneath the courtyard, which offered this sort of voluminous space for multiple uses. So it's this idea borrowed again from Buckminster Fuller, actually, who kind of coined this phrase about doing more with less. So it's this idea about reducing the moving parts of a building and what you put in, and really right down to those elements that all buildings need. So it needs structure, superstructure and substructure. It needs services, so air and water and electricity through this building. And it's about skin. It's about the fabric keeping heat in and cool out, but also obviously letting daylight and sunlight in as well. So it's about those three elements that buildings need, and really nothing more. And we're trying to do more with less, and we're also trying to make sure that everything we add to this building is doing more than just that one function. So structure is being used here. The concrete's being used to carry cooling through the building. So we're installing cold water pipework in the structure to provide the cool for the building. The facades are letting the air in, but they're also working in tandem with our conditioning, our sort of internal environment conditioning systems, by not letting too much solar gain in, letting air in and light in, but not enough, but not solar load. So we have a facade that changes in orientation, that it's closed towards the south at about 30% glazing, and then towards the north it opens up at about 60% glazing. So you naturally get that environmental, that passive response to the environment and orientation, providing a natural variation to the architecture on the facade. So again, doing more with less. So it's about ventilation through the facade and daylight. And even on the image on the right-hand side of this slide, that facade is only 1/3 solid and 1/3 glass and 2/3 solid. But in actual fact, the overarching kind of view is one of light and air and sort of sunlight and sort of light and shade. It's also about this idea of sort of symphony, if you like, of the services, the buildings, sort of arteries that sort of pass the sort of systems through the building of air and electricity and sort of fire protection as well, sort of life safety systems, bringing those to show, organising them carefully, but then above that having this concrete slab. So this is this thing about the kind of almost the sixth elevation. If the roof is can be considered the fifth elevation, the soffit surely is the sixth elevation and occupies a large part of the internal environment. So the idea of using that to provide character and using those functional elements to provide the character and personality of a space is something that really interests us. But above that is then this cold water pipework. So all embedded in the concrete. It's not a new idea for us. The Romans did it with hot water, as we know. Lubetkin and others did it with cool water, but the technology sort of 50, 60 years ago sort of let that system down. Today, with modern extruded plastics, we can have jointless pipework, miles and miles of it, without sort of fear of leaking. So it's a sort of very passive idea about cooling the building. And then this idea about allowing people to engage with the building, so the sort of users can engage with the building. This is just a quick image of a traffic light system that we have on each of those floor plates, and you have red days and green days. So a green day is saying you can open a window. The air temperature's outside within a certain range, such that if you open that window, you're not adversely affecting the internal environment, you're actually helping it. And we do that because we then turn off a lot of the mechanical ventilation. So providing air into the deep parts of this floor plate mechanically, like a lot of buildings do, generates or needs a lot of energy. So if you can reduce that and turn it off when you can open a window and feel the breeze, then you're saving about 25% of the energy and 25% actually of the carbon compared to a sort of standard equivalent building. So very simple passive measures of people coming into the floor plate and realizing that they can open windows or not. The building doesn't control that. It allows the occupants to do that, make that move themselves. So it's a building which has a multitude of facades and different aspects into different parts of the city. So this is the kind of broader facade opening onto the roundabout where we get these broad views. And you can see here, this is north facing. Facade is very open. And then you get these quite slender facades as you approach from the east, where the facades start to close down again. So again, about 30% glass on these facades. And this idea again about the closing of facades against those solar conditions and how this becomes a backdrop to the more historic context of this part of the city, the new and old coming together, as it does from the south of the site here. So these buildings are part of the same campus. So this is a number of residential apartments, shops and restaurants at the ground floor, and then other smaller office occupiers in some of those brick buildings as well. So it's creating a sort of campus of buildings around this new sort of heart of development, this idea of this sort of green lung, so people can move through away from the busy, noisy streets and use this as a thoroughfare as they make their journey through the city or through and into the buildings surrounding it. And then beneath that courtyard was this sort of leftover space. So we inherited the site with a basement. We filled that basement in part with cycle racks and plant and back of house sort of functions as all these big commercial buildings have. The space left over in the centre below the courtyard, it was around 10,000 square feet. It was double height, so 6-7 meters in height, with very limited daylight from above. It was a space that was felt was, these found spaces in buildings are often the things that are most memorable. Certainly when we look back at buildings that are 100, 150 years old and repurpose those for the 21st century, one often finds that there's an idea that some of those quirky spaces are the ones that people are more interested in. And so much so for us that we've taken the space ourselves as an extension to our London office and created another studio for us. And this is particularly pertinent. We've delivered this through the sort of pandemic, so it is as empty as it looks on the image until we're allowed back in there probably in June when Boris releases us all from lockdown. But it was a space that's allowed us, given us the ability to breathe a bit and sort of widen the space for each of our members of staff, and provides, really sort of puts our money where our mouth is. So when we say to clients, build these spaces, they will come. They built it and we happen to come to it because it really suits our needs. So a really exciting space for us to sort of inhabit post-COVID, with limited daylight from above and using circadian lighting, artificial lighting, following the rhythms of daylight outside and linked through sensors to daylight outside levels and sort of color temperature as well, changes throughout the day to make this a kind of a sort of healthy looking environment. So quick journey through this building from reception, from the main entrance approach, and as I say, quite a robust and sort of gritty street presence at Old Street Roundabout, into what we refer to as a kind of turbine hall rather than a kind of reception hall. This idea that everything's stripped back, so structure, services and skin are really the only things that you see here, other than furniture, of course, loose furniture. And it's a principle which really tested the boundaries of speculative commercial office space. There are a lot of naysayers at the start that are sort of very sort of familiar and comfortable with the sort of vanilla sealed box for workplace, and we wanted to sort of change the attitude towards that, and the developer, our client, was sort of the driving force behind that. But nevertheless, we ended up with this building being pretty much fully occupied within 6 months of completion by a range of occupiers. So whether it's traditional institutions like banks and insurance companies, more creative institutions like Adobe, sort of software manufacturer or developer, or we've got Capital One, which is a bank, or we have the engineers, AKT, who are actually the engineers for the building, now have the building as their home. So it's a building where everything is on show, structure, services and skin, with very generous opportunities to move through the building, so generous hallways and lift lobbies. The idea which, we finished this building in 2016, and it's this idea that opening up lift lobbies to staircases. Staircases normally kind of hidden out the back, you know, they're only used in the event of a fire. Whereas we felt people want to walk up and down staircases. There's this nice idea of kind of human collisions where people literally bump into each other and sort of start to talk and collaborate and spark ideas. The idea of not being crammed into a lift, but being able to open up and use staircases. And I think post-pandemic, this is sort of ever more important. So we open up those staircases to the lobbies, but of course doors you need for fire for in the event of a fire, but they only ever used in the event of a fire. So for the most part, the building is open for people to move through it and connect to staircases, and connect to staircases connected to the outside as well to enjoy those views across the city. You know, really important. And we do find sort of anecdotally from the building that people are increasingly using the staircases and decreasingly using the lifts for all the obvious reasons, particularly post-pandemic. So the idea of how this building's been fitted out, a number of different occupiers who all start to then enjoy that filigree idea of daylight coming through the facade in controlled ways, how the building offers opportunities for larger volumes of occupation, so double height spaces towards the top of the building. That idea about the club at the top of the building, so the building occupants can come out and break out and have a coffee or a beer in the evenings, and also break out into the outside space, the outside terrace, and then also, if you're that way inclined, take a run on the running track at the top of the building. So all amenities to break out and converse with your sort of fellow building occupants, and giving that sort of fluidity and flexibility of the way that people approach work. And as I say, you know, ever more important now as we emerge out of the pandemic. And the rooftop terrace as well. So the White Collar Factory building was it was a project which really was about 10 years in its making, from working on other buildings to the concept, to the prototype, to the physical building fully completed and let. The next iteration of that then brought us to Bristol. So this is the assembly building, which some of you will have seen is going up on Temple Way. And it was for us the next stage in this attitude towards creating better, characterful workplace. So that idea about making the ordinary buildings extraordinary, you know, the buildings of every day. These buildings have somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people within them. So if you can touch and improve their lives just on their day-to-day working sort of experience, then that's architecture working, you know, sort of really hard for you. So this was a project, as I say, the next iteration of the White Collar Factory principle. So doing more with less, putting fewer things into buildings. It's a site you're all familiar with. It's a site that actually laid vacant for a number of years. It used to have this building on it. Some of you will remember it. I certainly do. A building that was there for about 35 years before its carbon was released by it being knocked down and sort of the site leveled. And as it says here on the top left there, the site laid empty for about 8 years. There was a planning application made by another architect with another client to put 2 buildings back on the site, but this was never realised. We came in working with AXA as an investor into Bristol. So sort of like all these projects, investment from pension funds, taking long-term views. So we won this project in competition. Based on some very early sort of sketch ideas that actually held true right the way through to what we've produced. So this idea about opening the site up and providing public realm on the river, very few moments where buildings can do that, and we can do that in our city along the floating harbour. Wherever we do that, it's, you know, it's a surefire hit. It's always very popular. In this instance, this site is south facing onto the river, so really great opportunity to link it with this river, link the city with its river and buildings around that. It's about enhancing the site margins and providing some space for buildings to breathe. It's about sort of framing key views. In this case, it was the Pip and J Church, and framing a key view between river and the church so that buildings didn't encroach on that view. And it's also about this idea that buildings themselves can frame views and create the idea of interest and intrigue to then continue on routes. In this case, a historic route which was once lost, brought back into sight. So a number of diagrams here that just shows us, you know, this project was about 12 months in its design before being submitted for planning. This is just a snapshot of some of those moves. So the idea about taking that site boundary, maximising its footprint in order to hold the street edges, understanding some of the moves sort of encouraged by the consented scheme, the previous project, looking at what can be improved on that. This idea of creating this new route or re-engaging a historic route. So this is Cheese Lane, which I love as a name, that continues onto Bread Street, the other side of Temple Way. So reintroducing that across the site to open the site up, opening up views of the river and access to the river. So forcing the buildings apart on the river's edge and creating this heart towards the middle of the site that links these views from church through to river. And that the next slide just indicates that. So this idea of this sort of connection from station to city, this idea that we're introducing a pontoon on the river's edge to increase that, extend that walkway from Temple Meads through to our site and then up into the site and then on towards the city, and those connections, those visual connections between church and river, as I say. And then it was about sort of picking up on some of those principles established in the White Collar Factory sort of project and moving them forward again. So 10 principles about making a place, about creating that journey. So journey on approach to the building, through the front door, all the way up to desk. You know, that enjoyment of the building has to work hard all the way through that sort of journey. All too often we enter buildings, go in to find the sort of sole function of that building, and then are left feeling slightly disappointed. You know, all the effort was made on the front door and that sort of curb appeal. You know, we feel that sort of enjoyment needs to continue through every part of the building. So it's about generous and flexible floor space to attract lots of different occupiers and allow lots of change, you know, buildings that are robust to that change, enhancing the user's experience of the building and how they can interface with the building. You know, all too often buildings can be very closed and sort of control their own environment, whereas we believe humans should be in control of that environment. And obviously adding amenity and delight, really important, as I say, in post-pandemic developments. The idea around supercores, around how people move up and down buildings through staircases rather than lifts necessarily. The idea about passive systems, smart servicing, so not creating problems that you then have to throw technology at, so facades close down against the sun. The idea about smart engineering, passing services through structure, you know, structure doing more than one function again, and the same with facades, and also how we then build it, how we construct it. Working with the contractors from very early on to understand the best ways of off-site construction and on-site, of course, minimising the number of trades and creating kind of carbon smart solution for construction. So it's about a building, as I said earlier, that provides for up to 3,000 individuals as one tenant, or a neighbourhood of tenancies as well. So different occupiers, large, small and medium. As it happens, this building has now been taken by British Telecoms as their regional HQ, which in itself is really exciting for Bristol. A bit of a shame that not more businesses could enjoy this building, but nevertheless a really amazing opportunity for them in the city. So it's about well-designed workplaces, about complementary facilities, so the idea about breaking away from work, and ultimately giving sort of occupants that satisfaction of where they work, where they want to come to work, and in doing so creating a sort of thriving, diverse community that better reflects actually the wider community in the city. So a lot of these ideas actually look quite sort of relevant today as we emerge out of the pandemic, but really were very much the direction of travel which we were on, along with a lot of our clients, and enjoying. And I think there's just really an acceleration of a lot of those ideas as we emerge out of the pandemic. So this idea about place, how that opens up onto the river, and this idea about these three buildings and the routes through. So you're holding street edges, but you're relaxing those edges within the centre of the project. And connecting to the city. So this is, you might not make it all out in this sort of tiny diagram, apologies, but this idea of us linking that walkway from River's Edge onto a pontoon beneath Temple Way and back up onto our site, and then onwards into the city via Castle Park. So as part of that, we look sort of wider afield. These are some sort of extracts from a report done by Space Syntax, who analyze movement of people and vehicles and pedestrians and cycles through cities and see what effect buildings have on those movements. So I won't go into the detail of this, but there's a lot of work done on the kind of wider sort of piece of city and how we move through the city from station to town and from east to west. So that creates a place which for us has sustainability and the environment at its core. So it's about a diverse, active public realm, opening up those margins and opening up those routes through. It's about reducing our carbon on using sort of passive design and efficient systems, whether it's about shading the building, so you're preventing that solar load, so you're preventing the need to throw kit at it. It's about using LED lighting where you need it, but lighting that reacts to natural lighting levels as well, so it's not lights on all the time. Photovoltaics, the idea about sustainable energy generation, as we find on a lot of modern buildings. And landscape, of course, coming, this sort of biophilic idea between buildings at public realm level being really important, and sort of using species of the area of the Avon Valley. And also on the roof terrace, on that fifth elevation, the opportunity for people to break away from work and convene at different roof terraces. So some are private, some are public to everyone else in the building, but different attitudes to how we engage with the city. And provide that extra greening, the kind of urban greening, which is something that really interests us and ever so more moving forward, and bringing that greening actually down onto facades as well with some of our more recent work. So some of the sort of conceptual diagrams about how we reacted to the context and some of those historic settings, how the floor plan, the building orientation meant that we could focus on the heart of development as being where we enter the buildings. The idea that Temple Way, as we know, is again quite a gritty environment. It's quite a noisy, dirty environment, which hopefully will improve over time. But the idea how we're using the building, the larger of the three buildings, as a buffer to protect the public realm in the middle. How we're creating the two different ends of the building. One reacts to the city, one reacts to the river. And the idea about big open floor plates and how that can then be shaded by bringing the structure from the inside of the building to the outside. So again, structure which we need for the building, let's do more with it, and let's bring it to the outside to provide some of that solar shading. So the idea that we're providing about 50% glazing on those more exposed edges, and then towards the south of the building, we're pushing facades back from the frame to provide then outdoor amenity for each of the office occupying floors, and in doing so provide all the shade where you most need it on the south facade. So we took those principles, applied them to the mass, applied them to the elevation, used the functions of things like staircases and lifts to then help articulate that sort of longest of elevations against Temple Way, and help activate that most, I guess, obvious sort of aspect of the building as it faces a city. So the idea of how people traverse up and down this building and are seen doing so on the facade of the building. Excuse me, take a quick swig. So yeah, how that facade, how the functions of a building are sort of played out and manifested on the facade, and that helps to add articulation and interest to the project. And how the idea about colour, colour is something which runs through a lot of our work. And it was sort of good fun finding local references and sort of finding the colour we wanted to apply to the frame. So the green, the I guess like olive green, was something which we think is embedded in parts of the history of Bristol. So it's quite interesting, that idea of industry and transport and sort of mechanics coming through to the mechanics of the building and being expressed on the frame of the building. So here we've exposed the steel frame. We've painted it that olive green. We've created those moments here, like here, that extension of Cheese Lane up towards Temple Way. So this is now fully accessible to the public on their journey through towards Castle Park. And ultimately brings you into the centre of development and the ability to then enjoy the public realm and its connection to the river, and in doing so provide this active frontage where everyone coming into these buildings are entering from this courtyard. So again, sort of borrowing ideas developed at White Collar Factory in London and bringing them to Bristol, so that next iteration of that idea. A bigger courtyard here than we had at White Collar Factory, enjoying level changes that all landscape architects love to get involved with. That opportunity to engage with the river and the city at different levels. More recent imagery about how the other buildings are starting to come into play. This idea about cycle provision being at front and centre of a development. So into the cycle store, it's all on levels, all at grade. So the cyclists have their own front door, not around the back, but as I say, front and centre. The sort of, again, picking up on ideas from White Collar Factory, sort of adding, sort of not covering up structure with superfluous layers of plasterboard and sort of follow on wet trades. But really, we need the structure, we need the skin. Let's use those as the architecture for the spaces internally and externally. So this idea of sort of opening up the volume, creating this sort of library feel, or sort of lounge feel rather, where building occupants can come and have meetings here in reception and enjoy cafe and potentially break out onto the public realm. So some more recent images, how the building's coming together. So you've all seen it emerging. These were from earlier in the year, as that the sort of the new sort of arch over Cheese Lane is appearing. The open floor plates, exposed steel frame inside and outside, ultimately. Some of that glazing coming in, so you can see large picture windows framing views of a city, and then opening windows, so every 3 meters. So even if this building is separated into individual office cells or meeting rooms, every space gets access to fresh air. So the idea about fresh air and sort of natural air and natural daylight into the building is really important. The orientation of the building as well, it's long, but it's quite shallow east to west. So it gives us the ability to take all the plant off the roof and distribute it across the floor plates. So rather than centralized plant, we sort of have local plant to each of the floor plates, where we draw air from the west facade off this sort of clean facade of the building or orientation, and then express it onto Temple Way on the so clean air comes in this side, stale air out the other, across that narrow dimension on the floor plate. So that allows us to work more effectively, so that you're not moving air all the way around the building from the roof down to the floor plate and around the floor plate back up and out. So the energy is less, so our carbon's less in the operational energy of this building. It also sort of results in a roofscape, which is then open for other uses like roof terraces and amenity, rather than being filled with building plant. So taking the idea of White Collar Factory, but again developing it one step further on for this building. So facade, where its orientation, the structure on the outside, the ability to open windows and then frame views of the city, creates the architecture, this sort of layered sort of depth to the facade, where the sort of the operational elements of the building, whether it's vertical circulation or the structure, is manifested on the facade of the building. And then so that's sort of coming towards completion, I think probably early summer of this year, as building 1. The other 2 buildings we're about to start with, so we've got building 2, which is on the river here in the red, and building 3, which is the blue building on the right hand side of this slide. So for these buildings, again, we took the concept from the first building but developed it even further. So as it says here, the second phase is not a copy of the first one, but an application of a kit of parts. And what we really did here was focus on how we put the building together, and working with the contractor from very early in the design phase to look at developing a template for a kit of parts. So putting less into the building, doing more with it. Again, this idea about loose fit, integral flexibility, both for us as designers and the contractor, how he wants to build it and how the end user enjoys it. So there's an efficiency of construction, both in time it takes to build, and obviously the energy it takes to build it, and then obviously the energy it takes to then run it. The idea about long life and loose fit, and creating better value both for the client and the contractor, who obviously needs to sort of make something out, find some value in that process. So it's about minimizing the number of building elements, minimizing the amount of on-site trades, so maximizing modular construction and off-site construction, minimizing wet trades and that sort of overuse or sort of reliance on wet trades and water, which ultimately goes down the drain. The idea about those key elements being finish and function, so structure again, providing finish. As I say, maximizing modern methods of construction, early contractor input, and interrogating every single element again and again as a design team, but also the contractor team, to make sure it's as efficient as it can be. So this project really took White Collar Factory principles, applied them through assembly building A, and then really focused on how we procure and deliver that concept. So really sort of focusing on the detail. And of course, also looking at, as we've done with the previous buildings, about orientation, working with our in-house specialists at how buildings overheat, how they're overshadowed by adjacent buildings. So actually how facades can then adapt to suit different conditions in its urban context and different orientations. So facade systems, again, where one can open windows, where facades are closed down to prevent that solar gain, but how there's a kit of parts that then can change in their assembly, in their organization, depending on orientation and depending on position on that facade. So you can see here in these diagrams how the amount of sort of opacity reduces as we go up the building. So where it's overshadowed by its neighbours, it's more open. Where it's up against the sky and that solar load, we close it down again to about a third open, 2/3 solid. So that starts giving us a very subtle idea about the architecture. So we're not having to apply anything else to the building. It's that sort of function coming through and manifested in the architecture. So just some very early conceptual images of it in the city. The idea again towards the north, how the core is positioned with the sort of functions of that core and its movement being manifested on the facade. The idea about it lining Cheese Lane, this connection through and through underneath Building A, but how the heart of the campus is where we enter these addresses and then maneuver through quite a sort of linear space and into the core and up the building. So quite a grainy image there, I do apologise, but this idea about lining the street with reception, so we have that active frontage and engagement with the street at Cheese Lane, this sort of wonderful cobbled street. The sort of functionality, the use of that space being very open again, open to the city and for the building users to enjoy. A couple of views there with the reception. This idea about this super core, so a super compact core, again, putting less into it, but then allowing staircases to be encourage their use with these sort of large circular picture windows. So as one traverses through the building, one can enjoy framed views as you descend and descend staircases with these sort of framed views over the city, and obviously daylight as well. And then sort of very unique shaped floor plate, this sort of arrowhead sort of wedge of a floor plate, and sort of which sort of frames a view towards the south and back up towards the wider part of the building. So really efficient open floor plates, lots of opportunities for different occupiers to enjoy. And then at the sort of prow of that wedge, or the nose of that wedge, if you like, the idea of providing, again, solar shading through balconies. So every floor plate gets its own outdoor amenity, overlooking the park and overlooking the river and the rest of the city beyond. So occupants get private roof terrace, private balconies, but then there's also a communal roof terrace at the top of the building, and again enjoying those views. And the idea that there's this sort of club room which different things might happen, whether it's a gym class or an important meeting or some other sort of uses potentially connected to community uses. But, this idea about engaging with the city and engaging with its rooftop there. So you see this sort of rooftop pavilion idea, which again then in turn helps to conceal some of the smaller elements of rooftop plant. And then just a couple of final slides of the third building, which is taking a bit of a backseat until the second building starts to emerge. But again, a smaller, more slender building on the river, how that engages and it is entered via that new crossing of the public realm from Cheese Lane and opening out onto the river. And again, as you open those views out towards the south and onto floating harbour. And that sort of vibrant, what we hope to be a vibrant, active public realm at the heart of the development. So the next project, or the last one I'm going to take us through, is number 1 Temple Way, building you're no doubt all familiar with, building as architects that we all are sort of very fond of. Brutalist building, one of very few in the city. We're doing similar work on the IBM building, Dennis Lasden's building on the South Bank, next to the National Theatre. So this is kind of our Bristol version of that. A building designed by Colin Beale and John Collins as part of the DRG group, and a really sort of functional building. Again, sort of following sort of for us, our ideas, whether it's white collar factory or assembly, these guys were doing it for this building 50, 60 years ago. So building designed for Bristol Evening Post. A building which we found is an amazing archive on this building, including the original cardboard model, which we found in the basement store of the building. So lots of opportunity to engage with the original design and the concept. And it was an idea about this building being around the clock. So it's about the sort of writing, editing, production and distribution of post, of sort of printed press. It's a building which sort of followed its inner workings onto the outside of the building. So each of the different interconnecting volumes, whether it's circulation vertically or some of the other sort of pieces. So you've got the windowless plant room, which is sort of halfway up the building, weirdly for commercial building. This has a plant room top, middle and bottom. But this then fed into the printing press building, printing hall, which is now gone on the left-hand side. The idea about editorial, composing and dispatch sort of being contained in different vessels as part of the building as well. A building which was by brief designed to be quite inward looking, quite private, but the only public facing element was the forum and staff access facilities, as you see on the image on the right hand side where its current front door is. A building which has sort of since the press leaving it, and obviously our attitudes to how we read and sort of absorb news is very different today. So a building which was designed for such a bespoke use and function has really struggled, I think, in the latter part of the 20th century to really sort of find better sort of more appropriate uses. But nevertheless, a building which has captured carbon and is a robust building, which should be robust to change. But a building that's kind of lost its way a bit. It's sort of accrued lots of elements in trying to make it attractive as a workplace. The concrete, the sort of wonderful coffers on the soffit need a lot of work to clean them up and improve them. A lot of the original interiors have been lost, so a lot of the concrete has sadly been painted and a lot of it also covered up. So we're going to hopefully try and release a lot of that. The idea of their solution towards solar gain on the west-facing main entrance with these coloured panels, and obviously how it engages with that subway and sort of big improvements to be made around that. And it's sort of very fortress-like building at street level, as I say. So for us, it's about converting it or repurposing it and reinventing this for 21st century. So a building designed for the production and distribution of press to a building, we hope, designed for 21st century office occupation or a flexible range of uses. So what we've tried to do is retain as much as we can with the building and find different uses for it. So it's this idea that the old plant box could become this flexible space for leisure. The idea of a sort of everyman theatre sort of cinema might go into there. It's this sort of windowless box that has height to it, so it has a really interesting kind of opportunity for different functions there. And again, trying to extend the operational sort of timescale of this building for as long as possible, not just for office hours, but into the evening as well. So 21st century workplace, food and beverage uses at street level, the idea about roof gardens and breaking out again, and this idea of leisure uses within it. So again, a sort of city sandwich for Bristol. We've looked at a lot of alternative schemes for this building. As I said right at the start, we've got a really active model shop, which is really a great resource for us to test in 3 dimensions how you might interlay this building with a number, these were all iterative design responses, and there's a whole other cardboard box full of even more models that represents different ideas that we tested. But ultimately, it's about understanding the original building, looking at this asymmetric balance of volumes, adding new volumes to the original in amongst the original, so this sort of Jenga connection of old and new coming together, bringing daylight down the building. These are very deep floor plates, very inward looking. Modern office occupiers, we need access to daylight and air, ever so more now with sort of narrower floor plates. So bringing daylight down and through the middle through a new atrium is really important. And then how you might sort of top the building with a new mass, which doesn't dominate but sets back and does a sort of inverse or a flip of some of the boxes that exist below. So some of these cantilevers, we look to replicate that sort of striation of these sort of broad shadow gaps and these sort of shelves of accommodation. We continue that, but change the proportions as we go towards the top of the building. So it's a kind of lighter weight top to the heavyweight bottom. And then a couple of moves here in this slide about how we take the existing mass you add a sort of dumb mass on top, and then you start to articulate that by extending cores through and atria, and stepping down and stepping away from those more sensitive edges. So you create this multi-layered building of new and old coming together, and providing another version, a sort of new datum for that silhouette of this building against the city skyline. We're creating a new version of that slightly higher up the building. So this section image just shows how that city sandwich works. So the idea of a lot of cyclists at the ground floor, offices, a small degree of car parking, although we hope to maybe lose that in due course. The idea about leisure facilities coming in halfway up the building where the plant would have originally been, and then more office space and gardens, intermediate and terraces, and at the top of buildings as well, these rooftop terraces. So engaging with the public realm, identifying how the original building really failed the city in its approach to the public realm. The yellow areas here are really what we felt we could designate as being truly open to the public. So a small convenience store on the corner and the main reception. This, as part of that original brief, being the only element open to the public, or kind of visually open at least to the public. So lots of problems around the ground floor, which we've sought to enhance and open up. So extending that notion of the yellow, that notion of public space. So whether it's shops and retail, office reception, cafes in, more retail, food and beverage here, different access to maybe a basement gym, or up to the leisure facilities halfway up the building, and then towards the rear of the building, engaging with the new public park, which is emerging here, and a new address, what was once where the vehicles left to distribute the post, is now, once a loading bay, is now an office and cycle entrance into the building as well. And then looking to sort of take away in order to improve public realm as well. So a couple of slides here, just looking at this, how the building engages with broad plain, and how we want to readdress the building towards the south and onto the sort of greenery, that sort of biophilic idea of opening onto broad plain. So we're bringing the main entrance around to the south. We're pulling the building back, so we're opening up these key views. So this main view, those who sort of cycle from the east and from Bath into Bristol could arrive here, and all of a sudden we've opened up that view on towards Narrow Plain and towards Castle Park. And as this image illustrates, really helping to activate this corner. So new reception with cafe and other sort of food and beverage and retail units either side, widening the pavement, providing lots of scope for cycle racks for the public. And just sort of visualizing that idea about a sort of lighter weight top on the heavyweight base. So where we are making a sort of new additions to the building, we're following the kind of spirit of the original, but also making sure that we're sensitive to it and not trying to copy it overtly. So we were interested in the idea about those wonderful coffers, that sixth elevation. Looking at the work of Erwin Hauer, a sculptor, we're inspired from between that and the coffers of the building, bringing that through 90 degrees to become a vertical surface, extruding that, layering it, and using it as this precast concrete veil to help provide some solar control for the new elements of office floor plate. And as you can see from some of these upper images, so Old Market Roundabout, the print hall, which used to sit here, now the student residence building, and how we're still maintaining the sort of stepping profile and silhouette of the building against the sky, how there's more mass towards the north, and it's stepping down towards the south and towards Broad Plain. And as you approach from Temple Way, the new entrance, this idea about this sort of finer grain of that new precast concrete sculpture, a kind of human scale street level, and then a sort of broader version of it at the top of the building where it's enjoyed from wider views. And then the approach onto Old Market, some of these side streets, seeing vertical circulation retained with new and old coming together towards the top of the building. And then I think that's my last slide, which just demonstrates how the sort of layering of new and old against that south elevation onto Broad Plain. So that's me done with a number of projects. Thanks for bearing with me. Thanks, Ian, for your patience. And I'll hand you over now to Ian Williams, who'll take you through some different buildings from different sectors that we're involved with in Bristol. Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm just going to try and share my screen. You've turned it off there, so that's good. Okay, so Here we go. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 projects that we have in the office, and they're at various stages of development. It's a new office building, the first one, a series of housing developments with Bristol City Council, and a later living scheme as well. The first one's is a new office building in 1 Portwell Square. It follows very similar principles to the white collar factory and the assembly building that Steve's just talked about.
So sorry, Ian. Can I just check? I can't see the screen. Can I just check if anyone else?
No, I can't either.
Oh, okay. All right.
It's not working.
Sorry.
Okay. Well,
Never
thanks.
sure if it's a delay or technical.
Yeah, well done. No, there you
There we
go.
are.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, we can see
Yeah,
it
that's
now.
all good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks, Ian.
Luckily, I hadn't moved on from this one screen, so I think you haven't missed anything. So this is the first slide. This is Portwell Square, which is right in the centre. Okay. So you can see here, this is Queen Square and Temple Mead Station. So the site that we're looking at is halfway between the two. We are currently our office is currently next to Queen Square, and we're looking to occupy a couple of the floors of this new office building as well. So it's right next to 100 Temple Street, for those who know it. We really like this building. We enjoy the depth of the facade and the way that it turns a corner. I mean, the depth of the facade, I think it's picked up in a lot of the stuff that Steve's just been talking about as well. So it's good principles for the building that we want to latch onto and use. There is a bit of dead space to the west. This is only, for those who don't know the building very well, it's 2 phases of a 3-phase building. So you can see on the next stage here, there's a sort of an area of blank brick facade on the west that was intended to be built upon. So we're looking to retain as much of the existing facade as possible on 100 Temple Street, and build within the gap in between, effectively. Our new core locks within the blank west facade. We're retaining the existing trees, and we have south-facing balconies, providing shading for the building. And we've also created a new pocket square off the Brunel Mile. This is an AXO that shows that it's 6 stories high. The ground floor kicks out at the base. We're intending to take up the bottom 2 floors of this building, we think, at the moment, with our new offices. As you can imagine, there's lots of interest in the office on that. It's not the easiest thing to design when you get a 500 architects asking about it. We're providing a simple large floor plate on each level, and the core sort of off to one side. It contains 2 staircases, both are on the outside of the building, and toilets and lifts in the centre. So the staircase is sort of more pleasant to be and encourage people to use them, as Steve's been talking about. The reception's a nice, simple reception, very high floor to ceilings, generally throughout the whole building, to create a sort of light and healthy atmosphere and building as well. We've vetted it sort of post-COVID world as well, and I mean all of the stuff that Steve's been talking about is perfect for that as well. So we've got passive ventilation around here and openable windows on every floor. This is a view from inside, looking onto the balcony. Yes. Yes. So yes, and also we've got lots of bike parking spaces as well. We've got twice as many amount of bikes as needed by BCC, and with corresponding lockers and showers as well on the ground floor. You can see here the balconies overlooking the stairs, creating the public square, creating a very deep facade which responds to the generous sort of equivalent on 100 Temple Square, 100 Temple Street, and the pocket park on the front there. On the bottom right of the image there, you can see an active edge. This isn't there at the moment. We're hoping that the council will open this up. There's an appetite to do that and sort of occupy the square. And an image of it to be at night as well, with a very visible front door as well, which is really key. So you can see it's sort of in the place of the emerging master plan here. You've got the Pocket Square off the Brunel Mile, providing some relief along there. It's not visible from St Mary Redcliffe steps as well. It's sort of pushed back enough to not impact on that. And it does step, you can see the massing sort of steps up to 100 Temple Street as well. So the next buildings that I want to talk about are a series of housing schemes that we've designed for Bristol City. The brief was to try and make their existing housing stock better than it is. And they're suited, they're a suite of schemes that are sort of are around the planning stage at the moment. We're only taking them up to planning currently with Bristol City. So the first one's in Boddington Walk. It's in Lockleys in North Bristol. It's a site of a former allotment site with Gainsborough Square to the west. BCC have tried a few times to develop this site. It's the whole of that area there. We've now managed to get planning for this project. Yeah. So you can see it's a tricky site. There's lots of constraints. It shows an existing cycle path that we need to maintain and improve. An SNCI nature reserve. And as you can see, there's lots of back-to-back conditions as well to repair a lot around the site. So it's although it's a large site, there's actually very little sort of developable area on this. So Legal and General have they're going to be developing this site out. They provide modular homes. We've had quite a lot of freedom on the outside of these buildings, but very little on the inside as they're sort of pre-packed and shipped out. But what it's meant is that we've been able to influence the public realm a lot more than we could have done. You can see there's some benefits of off-site construction via Legal and General. So this is the site layout of the site. You can see it's a linear park, and it provides 185 dwellings of varying sizes, mixture of 1, 2, 3, 4 bedroom houses, and it's a modular system, as I said. So this is the first scheme in Bristol to provide a biodiversity net gain, which is great, and it's also 50% affordable. It repairs, as you can see here, it repairs the back-to-back conditions. So this is existing back, and it creates a new back to it, and new streets that run parallel. We've integrated the parking within the street rather than doing parking lots. Which creates a good public realm with lots of trees around it, and trying to sort of disguise the parking as much as possible within the streetscape. We've paid a lot of attention to the thresholds and the front doors, and the defensible spaces, and the spaces between the buildings as well, because they're obviously very important. We're actually doubling the densities on this site. So usually an area would achieve about 25 dwellings per hectare in areas like this, whereas we're over 50 dwellings per hectare at the moment. And as I say, I think this is we've got planning approval for this now. So this is the second of the Bristol City Council planning schemes. I'll go through these quite quickly, but there's two that we've got in Knowle actually. They both follow similar principles to Boddington Walk. This is the first on Leinster Avenue. It's a U-shaped site that wraps to the south of Knowle, Sixth Form College. So Knowle Sixth Form College is up here, and that's the site around there. Again, we've got lots of back-to-back conditions around here, which we've had to repair. You can see the suds and the planting to the southwest. It contains 3 or 4 bedroomed houses, and there's also some bungalows at the top here at the northwest. It's also 100% affordable development as well. So I just snip back to there. You can see the sixth forms here. There's a sixth form centre here as well that I'll come on to in a bit quickly. Again, we paid very close attention to the front doors, the porches, and the sort of spaces between the buildings, and used a palette of very simple brick materials. We understand this is about to officially get planning approval very soon as well. So as I say, this is the sixth form building as well, which is part of the site, but is also sort of between the two sites. It mediates between the school and the existing development. I'll just go through this very, very quickly. It's a simple rectangular building with brick fins that help the shading and sort of mediate between the two. Housing to the south, it's the same bricks as the housing to the south would be. It's a sixth form special educational needs block, and it's also got a sports hall. You can see it's got very robust materials internally and externally. And the front doors sort of signified by a double height space and with some glazed bricks. Interestingly, the glazed bricks here is picked up in some of the details within the porches of the housing around it as well. So this is the third of the housing schemes in Kingswear. It's a hilltop site, so it's very similar to the other ones. The same principles again. You can just about see we've introduced the glazed bricks into the porches along here to provide a bit of interest. As it's a hill site, it's got great views, but we also need to make sure that it's got a great roof form as well, because it's visible from far away. And this has just been submitted to planning. So the last scheme I just want to talk about is the Vincent. It's a built scheme just at the top of Redland Hill, just south of the Downs. Interestingly, this is pretty much an extract of the presentation we showed you 5 years ago. I've updated some of the images at the end to show you some of the before and afters, but you might recognise some of these images. You can see the existing condition here with Queen Victoria House that sits at the top of Redland Hill. Redland Hill's down here. Overlooks most of Bristol from up here. There's a poor quality landscaping to the south with a car parking and a single-storey poor quality building here that's been demolished. You can see that the site was blessed with mature trees, although not all of them were great quality. But we've made sure we kept all of the grade A and B trees, especially around the edge, and also to sort of enrich the landscape as well. And there's a listed monument here as well, a grade 2 listed monument to Princess Charlotte. So it was originally built as a boys' school. It was then converted into a hospital, a convalescence home, and then more recently it was an office for Parson Brinkhoff just before we took it over. But we tried to be as sensitive as possible in its conversion, even though it was bashed around a lot in those years. You can see the site boundary in red here, and how Queen Victoria House relates to the landscaping to the south. There was an existing car parking that it sort of encroached into the front, onto the back of Queen Victoria House, but within that sort of formal setting. And also there's a no-build zone within this garden as well. As it's a later living development, we're keen to get level access across from the entrance of QVH to the new development zone. So we've carved an entrance between there's a sort of 1950s extension to the main house, Queen Victoria House, and we've carved an entrance through that and into the development zone here, and then delineated the low build zone to the south. Then we've created 2 new build blocks. We carefully set them within the development, so we get maximum views out and light into the apartments. They follow the same orientation as Queen Victoria House, and they step down the hill as well. We've zigzagged the elevations to provide modern day bay windows, so the inhabitants can look into the mature landscaping to the south and the west, and also to look out down Redland Hill too. You can see some of these examples of inspiration for the bay windows. And this is a visualization that we did of looking on that terrace, looking out, and the bay windows, and how they address the landscaping. So you can see here that the layered elevation with a new build block stepping down the hill. You can also see there's a little penthouse at the top of the existing 1950s extension that provides a little hat on there as well. And it also helps sort of the elevation as you're looking up the hill too. So this is one of the planning visualizations that we did. You can see that the level access between the new build blocks, and below there's a terrace with secure car parking at the back with buggy and bike stalls. And facing onto the garden, there's the communal facilities down below. A swimming, a spa, swimming pool, gym space, treatment room, sauna, and yoga room. You can see this is a more recent photo, finished photo. The same view, the visualization, but just after the planting went in last year, actually. So this is hopefully going to look more mature over the summer. Looking forward to seeing that. The view standing up, standing on the terrace between the two new build blocks, looking north. You can see the recessed balconies and the bay windows we talked about earlier. And a view from the south. You can see the large external balconies to the west of the new build blocks that look over the existing building and the new the refurbished landscape. A view of the pool and the lounges that people can sit out on in the summer. So in the existing buildings, also got communal offering. There's a commercial kitchen there, a restaurant, lounge seating, private dining space, and there's also a whiskey bar as well that's there. It's part of the offering. So this is a mixture of new build and existing buildings here. You can see how they're all very generous apartments. Most of the new build apartments have got external spaces. They sort of appear as external rooms actually within the apartment, which works very successfully. Feels like an extra room that you've got there. And also we've got some great spaces in the new build just by taking advantage of some of the quirks of the existing building as well and making the most of those areas. I mean, they do mean that we end up with more generous rooms, apartments within the existing building just because of these quirks as well, which is always a good thing. You see the grade 2 listed obelisk there for memory of Princess Charlotte, and the reinstated landscaping to the south. We've cleaned up the facades to create Queen Victoria House, and you can see the planted terraces there, stepping down onto the lawn. And the final slide, just about there's also a circular walk actually that sort of goes up and around here, around the back of the monument here, and then sort of feeds around the pool, and then back to the main entrance here. And so that's it. Thank you for your time.
Wow, you caught me by surprise there. Sorry. Thanks very much, Ian. And great. I thought that was an absolute fascinating story, I must say. It's I'm really looking forward to being able to going round some of these buildings once we're allowed to. Like the Vincent isn't far from where I live, and they've already said they'll show us around once we can. Yeah. And I guess the Assembly too will be able to go and look at.
Yeah.
I thought it's interesting, the story about the relationship of glazing to the orientation of the building, because that's come up on quite a few of the schemes that we look at through the Civic Society and have discussions about that. So we've got one or two questions, I think, on the chat line, if we've got time to do that. There's a couple of people saying they used to work in the dreadful building that was knocked down and the Assembly's replaced, which is interesting. And people were saying how good it was having stairs with views and daylight, and what materials actually used in the stairways at the Assembly.
Yeah, there's the stairs are a part of the main core that runs up the building. So consequently, that we expose the concrete from the structure to provide that material. The stairs themselves tend to be metal, and then using a checker plate to provide the slip resistance that we need. I think there was another question in the chat about the concrete and how sustainable it is, and which is a really good question because it is a challenge for us. It is, yeah. For the white collar factory building, which was a lot of concrete in it, it was about making building a building to last. So concrete buildings can last for 100 years or more. Almost indefinitely, the engineer told me at the time. And on that building, we knew there would be a challenge around the environmental issues. That building was actually, we achieved BREEAM Outstanding with it, and a whole host of other kind of top accreditations from LEED Platinum, which is an American accreditation, to lots of British ones. And to get there, we had to develop a very sort of challenging specification for the concrete, where we replaced 50% of the cement with different replacement additives, PFA and GGBS, which are sort of byproducts of coal-fired power stations. So you're reusing that, and so we did as much as we could at the time and built a lot of mock-ups and sample panels to test it, both in appearance, colour and performance, to get the sort of best we could. And in actual fact, if we were to do that project again today with those same engineers, they're working with some concrete contractors to develop an entirely cement-free concrete. That's all they've been allowed to tell me because it's so top secret. But I think there's a sort of acceptance that concrete is really important material. It's been used. I mean, the Romans used it. So it's not sort of going away. We need to just make it more sustainable, and our attitude towards it has to improve. It's a product. It's a material which is built to last. But we need to sort of find different sort of more environmentally conscious ways of creating it. It also helps technically with a lot of the issues that we face now, particularly post Grenfell, that sort of tragic sort of situation there, where fire sort of design in buildings is sort of ever more challenging for us. And there's been this kind of closing down of the industry post Grenfell, to almost a sort of resistance to everything, which means that steel frame buildings and other structural frames have to be protected, fire protected in lots of different ways. Concrete, however, is kind of super protective against fire. So we have to sort of weigh up the sort of environmental impact with sort of fire and sort of building life safety sort of attitude as well. So challenges in our industry, sort of which is why we do architecture, because we love a challenge. We love trying to solve problems. Yeah.
I had a more basic question about the assembly, which came in from somebody else, saying, how on earth are you going to stop pigeons resting on all those girders? Because there's so much exposed steelwork there, isn't there?
It is, absolutely, and yeah, pigeons and seagulls. It's a question we get asked a lot, actually, Simon, on buildings, whether in any city really, it's the same problem. I think particularly acute in Bristol, and it's there's no one answer to it. It's really about, the answer really is having a range of methods to deal with it, whether it's physical deterrents, which we tend to resist because they just sort of gather dirt and dust and sort of dead pigeons, it often seems, to whether it's the use of hawks, and also the use of kind of under license removal of sort of eggs from nests and so on, and other deterrents. So it's about the sort of management of those buildings and having proper facilities management in place to deal with it across the calendar year. So it's a tough one. Yeah.
John, you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Thank you. I just want to pick up on the point that Simon raised just now about different forms of fenestration on different elevations of the building, and particularly in residential buildings. Does this whole concept of making the building distribute and redistribute heat work where you've got a fairly broad residential floor plate with single aspect dwellings on, say, either side of a corridor? Not I'm a great fan of single aspect, but can it be made to work?
It's a really good question, because there's, particularly on single aspect residential, where you need to get daylight into the back of that space that can be quite deep, you have to open the facade up. And I think there's a real challenge in how we seal our housing buildings now. So they become super insulated, super sealed to stop air escaping and kind of cool in. So consequently, you have big windows with not a lot of air being able to sort of move in and out of it, and they're super insulated, and they tend to overheat. So we've sort of heard anecdotally from developers in apartment buildings that the heating pipes that run around buildings, distribute sort of water around buildings, are enough to heat them, and actually sometimes overheat them. So it is a real challenge. It's something Ian could probably talk about a bit more in his stuff, but it's something that single aspect apartments we try to avoid at all costs. So dual aspect and corner aspect, bringing daylight in from both sides and air through particularly post-COVID, is going to be really, really important. And I think actually there's sort of been a changing attitude towards that concept from a lot of the clients and developers we work with. I think since COVID, there's been a reset of their attitude towards the environment and how the quality of space that we create needs to improve. So we're sort of now pushing against more open door than we would have done previously as designers. But it's, I don't know, Ian, how you've
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd add to that is the quality of sort of the film on glass as well. I mean, the technology is getting a lot better these days, and you can get a nice clear film that doesn't impede the view in or out of windows, but actually cuts down the amount of sun going in by quite a lot.
Are there some examples of residential buildings of using that?
Well. I can't think of anything to come to hand, but I mean, yeah, I don't know.
Okay,
Steve.
Yeah, I think glass technology is facades are having to work ever harder for us, I think, from a technological point of view. And some of the technologies developed for the commercial buildings, some of the ones I showed, filter naturally down into sort of residential specifications as well. So there's this real synergy because all buildings face the same environmental challenges. What would be really interesting for me, a lot of my work's around sort of commercial sort of mixed use schemes in cities, is how actually buildings are going to open up more. Office buildings have always been about how you keep them cool, not how you warm them up, because the number of people and machines and computers and photocopies generate all that heat. How do you get rid of it? Whereas in actual fact, I think there'll be a tendency towards opening facades to get air in, which means you get a lot of cold in. So you're having to then heat buildings, office buildings, more than you may well have done previously. So it's a real sort of challenge for us actually in the industry moving forward. It's a good challenge because it's in the right direction now.
Thanks.
Jeffrey, you have a question. Unmute yourself and speak.
Oh, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I've got a question about the Assembly building and one about Temple Way. I've been going past the Assembly building quite a lot in recent months and admiring the steelwork and being fearful that somebody was going to clad this steelwork. It would lose it all. But I'm very pleased to hear it's going to be exposed, apparently, in a nice Bristol green and things. Question, though, is are there fire issues? I'm thinking of an intense fire, then the fire brigade come and squirt water on it. Does the steelwork buckle? How have you worked the fire engineering out on that? That's one question. I've got half an answer, but I'll wait to hear yours. The other one is on that one Temple Way. You're adding stories. Does this mean you're having to strengthen the structure? Or was there a machinery hall, which means you've got spare strength in the existing structure lower down already?
Yeah, good technical questions. Those I like those. So in answer to the first one for Assembly, so it's intrumescent painted at the Assembly building. We did a lot of work and sort of fire testing of assemblies to prove all of that. So we did sort of a computer modelling, or the fire engineers did rather, to prove that a lot of that work is done. But the real challenge is where the structure goes from outside to inside, and that thermal break, and not taking cool through the facade. And again, we did a lot of analysis to be able to design out some of those thermal breaks by saying that there's enough facade depth, and it's different on orientation as well, and up and down the building. We managed to engineer it to prove that those any condensation risk was fairly minimal. So we could reduce that that sort of thermal break. That in turn also helped with some of the fire engineering as well. So a lot of work. I think it's that thing about, as that saying, isn't it? You have to do more with less. It's more effort to make something look simple. So we've taken a lot of stuff away to expose it, but what you've exposed has to work harder for you. So we have to work harder to make it function. So, but yes, the steel will remain exposed. We did one similar building recently in Manchester, another steel frame building exposed on the outside, and up there was painted red because Manchester's a sort of city of red. And there's an unintended consequence of one of these urban climbers near completion decides to film himself climbing the frame like a giant climbing frame and jumping onto one of the balconies and sort of waving at the security guard. So that was good fun to watch on the CCTV. But nevertheless gives us sort of cause for concern at Assembly as well. And then in answer to your question on One Temple Way, yeah, there's enough inherent sort of capacity in the existing structure. It's a pretty robust concrete frame, and the concrete frame also gathers additional capacity over its lifetime. So there's a bit of that design capacity and the length of that. Plus, we're taking some weight out of the building to then replace it at the top. So it's within that capacity. So no works to foundations. I don't think we've got any column strengthening works. I think it's all sort of lightweight on top of the original. And the structure atop might be steel. We might even do it in timber if the insurance companies allow us to do that. And in actual fact, Assembly was very close to being built in timber as well.
Where are you with One Temple Way? Have you actually got planning permission for it yet?
No, we're in planning at the moment, and just waiting for committee date. We're going back to plans. There's a few questions that we're going back on, particularly around the public realm, and I think our developer will probably be made to pay for improvements to the subway, which which I think will unlock everything. Yeah, absolutely.
I think time's moving on, and we've lost quite a lot of people. I think we probably ought to draw a halt to this now, because time's moving on. It's gone 9 o'clock. I mean, I must say it's been a fascinating evening. So thank you both very much for doing it, particularly Ian for coming in at the last minute with Cormac being stuck in a planning committee. It's been great seeing how you've moved through all this, and so thank you all very much. We can't actually give you a clap, can we, on Zoom? But thank you both very much for your time this evening.
That's fantastic. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Simon. Thanks to everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.